Simon & Schuster Audio. The 5 Temptations of a CEO, a leadership fable. By Patric M. Lecioni. Read by Boyd Gaines, with an introduction and afterword by the author. Here's Pat Lecioni.
Being the chief executive of an organization is certainly one of the most difficult challenges a person can face in a career. But it's not a complicated one. Now, some CEOs, especially struggling ones, might disagree with this statement. They'll probably say that their jobs are riddled with complexities and subtleties that make success impossible to predict. And if their organizations fail, they'll probably point to a tired list of causes like strategic errors, marketing inadequacies, competitive threats, or even technology failures. But these are only symptoms of their real problems. You see, all chief executives who fail, and most of them do it one time or another, or in one way or another, make the same basic mistakes. They succumb to one or more of the 5 temptations of a CEO. Okay then, if a CEO's success hinges on just a few behaviors, then why don't more of them succeed? And why do they keep looking at these same financial statements, product development schedules, and marketing reports in search of a silver bullet? Well, I actually think Lucille Ball answers this question best. In an old episode of the I Love Lucy show, Ricky comes home to find Lucy crawling around the living room on all fours as only Lucy could do. When he asks her what she's doing, she explains that she's lost her earrings. "You lost your earrings in the living room?" he asks. Lucy replies, "No, I lost them in the bedroom, but the light is so much better out here." For many CEOs, the light is best in places like marketing, strategic planning, and finance, because these are safe havens from the painful darkness of behavioral self-examination. Unfortunately, they find little opportunity for meaningful improvement in these areas. Even relatively progressive CEOs like to stay in the comfort of their living rooms, where they sample management fads and leadership trends in search of relatively painless remedies for their ills. And while some of these remedies may work for a while, they eventually leave executives exposed to the same basic issues that caused their problems in the first place, and which are explored in this program. Now, the tragedy here is that most executives are intuitive enough to understand all this, but few of them actually do much about it. Instead, they unconsciously distract themselves and others from their personal leadership issues by getting overly involved in the details of their organizations, often to the point of creating complexity where it shouldn't exist. Essentially, what they're doing is putting the success of their organizations in jeopardy because they're unwilling to face and overcome the 5 temptations of a CEO.
The Fable.
Andrew O'Brien hadn't been the last person to leave the offices of Trinity Systems for 5 years. In fact, he hadn't stayed past midnight in months since he took the job of CEO. As he stared out the picture window from his office above San Francisco, he wondered how it had come to this. Tomorrow would be the 1-year anniversary of Andrew's promotion. It would also be the first board meeting where he would be accountable for the results of an entire fiscal year. Those results, as he had grown accustomed to saying, were unspectacular at best. But the results didn't bother Andrew as much as his state of mind did. Lately, he wasn't comfortable walking the halls of his company. He didn't feel at ease leading his own executive staff meetings, and certainly he wasn't looking forward to meeting with the board tomorrow. They probably wouldn't be too tough on him, he thought, but they wouldn't be patting him on the back either. Staring out toward the Bay Bridge, Andrew noticed that there were no cars heading east toward Oakland. That seemed odd. Andrew always marveled at the traffic that filled the city at all hours of the night. He looked over at the clock on his desk and saw that it was 12:02 a.m. Even at this hour, there were always cars on the bridge. Then it hit him. In his mind's eye, Andrew saw the orange road signs he had been driving by on his way home every night for the past 2 weeks. Bay Bridge closed for repairs, midnight to 5 a.m. It hadn't occurred to Andrew that he might need to cross the bridge at this hour. Slowly, it dawned on him that he would not be driving home tonight. On any other night, he would just check into one of the full-service hotels near the office, give his clothes to the all-night dry cleaning service, and be ready to go by morning. But tonight, Andrew wanted to sleep in his own bed, if only for a few hours. Besides, he was determined to see his wife and kids in the morning. Though he would never admit it, Andrew needed a little moral support. So he put his papers in his briefcase, grabbed his coat, and headed for the door. As he walked toward the Bay Area Rapid Transit, known to locals as BART, Andrew wondered how long it had been since he'd used public transportation. Had it been 8 years? 10? Taking a ticket from the machine on the wall, he went to a bench where his train would be arriving and sat down. Before he could even take his papers out of his briefcase, the train arrived. As it sped by him and began to slow, Andrew noticed that no one was on board. At least, that's what he thought. Taking the first seat near the door, Andrew suddenly felt exhausted. The train descended into the darkness of the tunnel which ran beneath the bay, and Andrew's eyes began to close. Just then, one of the connecting doors behind Andrew opened. He turned and saw an elderly man wearing some sort of uniform step into the car. He appeared to be a janitor of some kind. The name Charlie was patched onto the pocket of his gray shirt. Suddenly, Andrew felt uncomfortable. Should I talk to this man? He thought. Certainly he'll expect me to acknowledge him. There's no one else on the train, but what do I say? Before he could think of something to say, the white-haired man walked by him without saying a word, exited into the next car, and was gone. Andrew was surprised that instead of feeling relieved, he felt insulted that the janitor had just ignored him. But the board meeting intruded on his thoughts, and Andrew decided it was time to get to work. As he reached for his briefcase, the lights inside the car flashed, then faded, and the train came to a screeching stop. Sitting alone in the dim light, Andrew wondered if things could possibly get worse when the door leading into the next car opened. It was the old man in the janitor suit. "Come on. What are you waiting for?" And then he left. Without a great deal of hesitation, Andrew followed the man into the next car. The janitor was sitting with his back toward the door, whistling. Maybe it was because he was tired. Maybe it was because he was desperate for something to distract him. For whatever reason, Andrew walked up to the man and took the seat across from him. Before Andrew could speak, the old man said, "The heat in this car is the best on the train. On cool nights like this, I prefer coming here to talk." Andrew smiled. "To talk about what?" "Whatever you want to talk about." Puzzled now, Andrew asked the obvious question. "I'm sorry, sir, but do I know you?" The old man smiled. "Not yet." Now Andrew was convinced the old man was nuts. "So then you work on the train?" "Sometimes I do, if that's where I'm needed. What do you do for a living?" For a moment, Andrew seemed at a loss. "Well, I guess I'm in technology." "What kind of technology?" "All kinds, really. Everything from calculators to commercial computer systems. I work for a company called Trinity Systems." "Oh, yes, I've heard of that. So you're a technical guy, then?" Andrew paused. "Actually, I'm the CEO. My name is Andrew." "Well, I'm Charlie. Nice to meet you." As they shook hands, Andrew noticed that the old man hadn't reacted at the mention of his title. He wondered, does he even know what CEO stands for? Aloud, he asked, "What exactly do you do?" Charlie smiled. "Listen, Andrew, we're not here to talk about me. Let's talk about you. Why don't you tell me what's bothering you?" The old man's quirky response almost amused Andrew. "Well, Charlie, I don't know how much you know about business, but being a CEO is pretty complicated." "It is?" Like a spy, the old man looked around the empty train. Then he leaned over toward Andrew. "Now, I don't go around telling just anyone this, Andrew, because I don't want to sound like I'm bragging. But when I was a boy, my father ran a company, and I learned a thing or two from him." "You don't say. What kind of company?" He was expecting a hardware store or a dry cleaner. But Charlie said, "It was a railroad, but that's not the point. My father always said that running a company was running a company regardless of the type of business. And something else he said, don't take this wrong, Andrew, because I'm sure you're very good at what you do. But my father also said that it wasn't complicated, running a company, I mean. He used to say that people make it complicated because they're afraid to look at the simple issues. Now Andrew was beginning to feel annoyed. Charlie, tell me something. How does the son of a railroad president become a janitor on a BART train? Andrew, what in heaven's name does that have to do with your issues? If you don't think I have anything valuable to share with you, just say so. I'll be glad to move on to the next car and find another CEO to talk to. Andrew was impressed by the old man's self-assuredness, and he smiled as he imagined the old man trying to find someone else on the train to talk to at this hour, no less a CEO. He decided to be charitable. So you think I'm making it too complicated, do you, Charlie? Charlie answered the question as though it had been asked with complete sincerity. I can't say for sure, Andrew, because I'm not sitting in your chair right now, but I can say that being a CEO should be conceptually simple, unless, of course, you're failing. Immediately, Andrew's cheeks turned bright red and his ears began to burn. Charlie noticed. Are you failing, Andrew? Because if you are, then we have to talk. I certainly hope you're not giving in to any of the temptations. Andrew sat up just a little. Listen, Charlie, I'm not failing. The company is struggling a little, but there are lots of reasons for that. Certainly I don't consider myself to be a failure. But what do you mean by temptations? I mean that if you were failing, and it sounds like you don't think you are, but if you were, then you would have to be giving in to one of the 5 temptations that all CEOs face, or heaven forbid, more than one. Before Andrew could formulate a question, the lunacy of the situation hit him. He thought, here I am, sitting on a BART train in the middle of the night, letting myself get upset because an eccentric janitor thinks I might be failing. He wanted to end the conversation and get back to thinking about the board meeting, but the janitor had piqued his curiosity. Could you just quickly tell me what the 5 temptations are, Charlie? Charlie didn't answer directly. Sit back for a few minutes, Andrew. I've got some questions to ask you. Andrew took a deep breath, looked at his watch, and leaned back in his seat. Charlie said, Tell me this, Andy. What was the best day of your career? Andrew considered asking the old man not to call him Andy, a nickname he'd worked hard to kill ever since business school. Then he decided it wasn't worth the trouble. I'd have to say the day I was promoted to CEO 1 year ago tomorrow. Charlie seemed disappointed by the answer. Not judgmental, just disappointed. Why is that? Why? Gee, Charlie, being CEO is a pretty big step in a person's career. I worked for 20 years to get where I am. Okay, then, what about the second best day? Andrew took a breath and described his first promotion to vice president, and about how it was the first time his salary cracked 6 figures. Charlie was slowly nodding his head as though he had figured something out. Okay, I don't want to be too critical, but I think you've given in to temptation number 1, Andy, and it's the toughest one to fix. As much as he wanted to dismiss Charlie's words with a laugh, Andrew felt a sense of authenticity in the old man that wouldn't let him discount his advice completely. Still, he didn't want Charlie to sense his concern. What is this, Charlie? Right off the bat, I'm not fixable? Possibly. Some people are just not cut out to be a CEO. Okay, Charlie, what makes you think I've given in to temptation number 1? What is temptation number 1, anyway? Charlie paused. Well, Andy, I can't be certain, but it seems to me that you may be more interested in protecting your career status than you are in making sure your company achieves results. Imagine that I were to ask the President of the United States the same question I just asked you. Mr. President, what was the biggest day of your career? What would a great president say? Andrew shrugged. What are you getting at, Charlie? Well, imagine the president saying that the greatest day of his career was Election Day or Inauguration Day. Andrew frowned. To tell you the truth, Charlie, that sounds like a pretty realistic answer to me. Extremely realistic, and that's the problem. You know what my father said when I asked him about the best day of his career? He said it was a toss-up between the day the railroad opened its first passenger line west of the Mississippi and the day the company first turned a profit. You see, a great president of the United States wouldn't be as proud of being elected as he would of actually accomplishing something. Or take a great basketball coach. There isn't a great coach alive who would say that his best day was getting hired. Winning games and championships is what great coaching is all about. So you're saying that people shouldn't be proud to reach milestones in their careers? Of course they can be proud of milestones, but not as proud as they are of actually doing something with their status. In fact, great CEOs should be almost overwhelmed by the need to achieve something. That is what they are driven by, achievement, not ego. Why couldn't a person be so motivated by his ego that he would drive for results? Lots of CEOs have big egos. Charlie seemed stumped, but just for a moment. That's true. I suppose a CEO could be driven by ego, but it wouldn't last for long. Once a person's ego is initially satisfied, they turn their efforts towards enjoying the fruits of their new status. They work fewer hours. They worry less about the company's performance than they do about their own level of comfort and status. Of course, when the company shows signs of failure and the CEO's status is in jeopardy, then he might work hard again, but not because he's concerned about the company. He's really only concerned about his image. Charlie paused before his next question. Why is it again that you're working so late tonight? I can't imagine that you usually work these hours. Oh, no, I'm usually home by 7. But there's a board meeting tomorrow, and things aren't looking so good. Suddenly, Andrew made the connection. He sat in silence, contemplating the point, and seemed unaware of Charlie's presence. At last, he decided it was time to change the subject. Okay, Charlie, I can admit that it's sometimes tempting for a CEO to put his career, his status, even his ego a little too high on the list of priorities. That's good advice. I could probably work on that one myself. Charlie shook his head. It's very hard to overcome this one. It's part of who you are sometimes. And even if you are able to resist the first temptation, there are still 4 more that can sink you. Andrew took a deep breath. This is starting to sound pretty negative, Charlie. Not negative, just difficult. I said before that being a good executive, especially a CEO, is extremely hard. But remember, Andrew interrupted. I know, it's not complicated. You don't really believe that, do you, Andy? Not yet, but go ahead. Okay. Let's assume that you're not overly focused on your career, that you are completely driven by the results of your company. You can still fail if you give in to temptation number 2, wanting to be popular with your direct reports instead of holding them accountable. Andrew rolled his eyes. That's it? I mean, accountability is the most overused buzzword in business today. Every time something goes wrong, people say that there should be more accountability. I told you it's simple. Well, Charlie, I can say that I don't have a problem with accountability or popularity. Let's move on to temptation number 3. Okay, but first let me ask you why you're so sure about this. With a look of feigned contriteness, Andrew explained. Well, for starters, last week I fired my head of marketing. I'm not afraid to take action when I have to. I see. Why exactly did you fire this marketing guy? What's his name? Terry. I fired him because he wasn't getting the job done. He was here for 10 months and he wasn't cutting it. He came to meetings unprepared, his advertising ideas were stale. He wasn't generating the kind of leads that sales needed. So what did you do along the way? I'm sure you talked to him at some point during those 10 months before you fired him. Oh, sure, I talked to him about things, but for the most part I treated him just like anyone else. In fact, I'd have to say that I actually liked Terry better than most of my other direct reports. You saw that he was struggling? Oh, yeah. Our head of sales said she wasn't getting the quantity or quality of leads she needed, and none of us thought the advertising was worth a damn. What did you say to Terry? I told him that Janice, she's my head of sales, Janice wanted more high-quality leads. I mentioned that I liked last year's ads better than his new ones. What did he say? That he was still learning the ropes, which sounded reasonable to me. He was still pretty new. And things didn't change? That's right. So I asked him how things were going, and he said that the situation he inherited from the last marketing guy was worse than he had imagined. He said it was going to take longer than expected to turn things around. Did you do anything specific at that point? Cut his pay? Withhold a bonus? Anything like that? Andrew frowned. No. Not giving him a bonus or cutting his pay would have been harsh. He's just moved his family halfway across the country. So I guess you didn't tell him that his job was in jeopardy either. No way. I didn't want to make him nervous. I figured things would probably improve with time and that I shouldn't do anything that might defunctionalize him. And then, 3 weeks later, I fired him. For a moment, just a moment, Charlie and Andrew stared at one another as they contemplated Andrew's response. And then they started laughing in a guilty kind of way. Charlie stopped laughing first. Just like that, Andy? You just fired him? Trying unsuccessfully to wipe the guilty smile off his face, Andrew defended himself. No, of course not. Sales were still lagging. Then Terry placed a horrible ad in USA Today last month. I started getting calls from board members wondering what was going on in marketing. I decided it was the right thing to do. Was he surprised? Oh, yeah. For a second there, I thought he was going to cry, which told me that he was out of touch. He should have known that he was in trouble. I mean, we talked about generating more leads at every staff meeting, and nothing seemed to change. Charlie frowned. Andrew, I'm going to be tough on you. Why didn't you tell Terry that you would let him go if things didn't improve? I already told you. We talked about lead generation at every meeting. Yes, I know, but that's quite different from telling someone that he might lose his job. If you were fired tomorrow by the board, would you be surprised? This hit too close to home for Andrew. That is totally outrageous, Charlie. The board is not going to fire me. The old man held up his hand. I'm sorry, Andy. I didn't mean to say that they actually are going to do something like that. Andrew took a deep breath. I'm sorry. It's just that it's late and I've been under pressure. What were you saying, Charlie? I was just asking how you would feel if the board was thinking about replacing you, without telling you. Andrew now considered the question intellectually. Well, certainly I wouldn't be happy, but the truth is it happens all the time. Boards don't give CEOs lots of warning and advice. They aren't the CEO's manager. I see them as a control function more than anything else. That's true, but you were Terry's manager. Andrew rubbed his eyes as he pondered the point. You know, I have to say that I didn't really see myself as Terry's manager. I don't think I'm Janice's manager or anyone else on my team. Charlie seemed taken aback. Why in heaven's name not? Because they're all adults, and they're experts at what they do. Who am I to tell them how to do their jobs? Charlie smiled a knowing, parental smile. Andrew felt Charlie's disapproval, and he finally broke. Okay, Charlie, I'll tell you why I never told Terry that he might lose his job. For one, he's older than me by almost 10 years. It feels pretty damn weird telling a guy who reminds you of your uncle that you might fire him. Second, he knows a hell of a lot more about marketing than I do. How was I supposed to second-guess his decisions? My background is in electrical engineering. 3, Terry was one of the few people on my team I could go to and talk about the pressure I was under. He was probably more supportive than anyone on my staff. I didn't want to lose him as a sounding board. So you thought that if you told him about your intentions, he might not like you as much and might not feel like being your confidant anymore. You were afraid to be unpopular, Andrew. Come on, Charlie, I fired the poor guy. Yes, and now you don't have to deal with him anymore, do you? It's one thing to hold someone accountable for something and come back the next day and deal with him. It's another to fire him and never have to talk to him again. Stunned, Andrew just sat there, digesting Charlie's words. Even Charlie was shaken by the directness of his tone. I'm sorry, Andrew. It's just that... In a daze, Andrew interrupted, as though he hadn't even heard the beginning of Charlie's apology. You know something, Charlie? As horrible as it sounds, I know plenty of CEOs who do the same thing. It's not as cut and dry as you make it sound. There are all kinds of personal dynamics and contexts to deal with. Yes, it is very common. But that's because those CEOs don't understand the difference between holding someone accountable and deciding to fire them. Andy, in 17 years as CEO of the railroad, do you know how many people my father fired? He only fired 5 people. But plenty of people left the company because they couldn't perform. My father was a fanatic about performance. People who worked for him knew that they either produced or were gone. So how come he didn't fire more people? Because he told them what he expected and reminded them of those expectations constantly. When they failed, he made the consequences clear, whether it was financial or otherwise. Eventually, if a person couldn't find a way to improve, they would just leave. What about the 5 people he did fire? 2 of them violated company rules. My father never told me what they did. The other 3 were people who just couldn't come to terms with their failures. They couldn't bring themselves to leave, so my father did it for them. Your dad sounds pretty tough. Yeah, I guess he was tough. But it crushed him to fire those people. Still, he had no choice. Come on, Charlie, sure he had a choice. Not in his mind. If he had let those 5 stay, he would have been letting people down. You mean shareholders? No. My father felt a sense of duty toward all the people who left on their own when they couldn't perform. He felt like he had to uphold the standards they held themselves to. Your father sounds like a wise man, Charlie. I bet he was a great CEO. Andrew paused. Now, don't take this wrong, Charlie, but I'd have to say that business today is a little more complicated than it was back then. Why do you say that? Andrew laughed. Where should I start? There's global competition, technology changes, more regulations than ever before. It's just complicated. Back then they had government protection, cheap labor. Things are harder today. Charlie raised an eyebrow. So, this situation with Terry, you don't suppose that my father's approach would have worked? To be honest, probably not. I wouldn't have known specifically what to hold him accountable for. I would have been guessing. This industry is complex, and I can't pretend to know more about marketing than Terry does. He's the expert. Charlie leaned forward. So let me get this straight, Andrew. It's not fair to hold a guy accountable for something specific because you aren't an expert in his field, but it's fair to fire him without warning when he doesn't meet your expectations. Do I have that right? Andrew didn't know what to say. It isn't that simple, Charlie. It is that simple. That's the point, Andy. It's not supposed to be complicated. You make it complicated because you're not facing your own issues. At this point, Andrew felt challenged by the old man. Okay, Charlie, why do you think an intelligent person with an MBA would want to be popular rather than hold someone accountable for their job? Ah, that brings us to temptation number 3. The temptation to ensure that your decisions are correct, the temptation to choose certainty over clarity. Some executives fear being wrong so much that they wait until they're absolutely certain about something before they make a decision. That makes it impossible to hold people accountable. I'm not sure I'm following you. It's simple. You can't hold people accountable for things that aren't clear. If you're unwilling to make decisions with limited information, you can't achieve clarity. Okay, I get it. But what kind of things are you talking about? Simple things, important things, like the purpose of the company being in business, its goals, the roles and responsibilities of people in the organization to meet those goals, the consequences for success and failure, all that stuff. Andrew nodded. Vision, mission, values, goals, business school stuff. Don't take this wrong, Charlie, but none of this is new. Of course not. People talk about this all the time. So then tell me. What is your vision of the future for Trinity? Andrew frowned, scratched his shoulder like a kid trying to avoid a scolding. Charlie was surprised. "Don't you know?" "Yeah, it's just we're having a hard time settling on the right way to explain it. In fact, we'll probably discuss it again tomorrow at the board meeting." "How long have you been working on this, Andy? A month? 2? 8 months. 8 months? What in God's name is taking so long?" "Well, it's just that the market is changing, and we're trying to figure out whether our current business is going to be able to sustain—" Charlie interrupted. "I'm sorry, Andy, but this is ridiculous. And please excuse me for saying this, because I haven't known you very long, but not having a vision is no one's fault but your own." The truth hit Andrew hard. He wanted to defend himself, but before he could get the words out of his mouth, Charlie beat him to it. "And don't tell me it's more complicated than that. What is preventing you from coming to some conclusions on something as big and important as your company's vision?" "I wish I knew." "You do know, Andy. It's just that you have to admit it to yourself. Face your fears. You must have some idea about what the future of your company should look like." "Sure I do." "So why haven't you put it on paper, announced it to the company, and used it to guide the decisions you make?" After a long pause, Andrew finally responded. "Because I'm not sure it's right yet." Silence. The sentence just hung there. At last the lights flickered on and the train began to roll forward. Charlie asked, "Andy, were you ever in the military?" Andrew shook his head no, and Charlie nodded. "I didn't think so. Well, in the military, they teach you that any decision is better than no decision." "I've heard that before, but this is different." "You're right, Andy, this is completely different. Nobody's life is on the line here." "I tell you what, Charlie, I think the whole vision-mission thing is overrated." "I agree. I think that having a great vision and mission is only important if you know how to execute. I'll take a well-executing company over a visionary one any day." "Exactly." Andrew was relieved when Charlie agreed with him. Then the old man asked the next question. "So what are your goals for the next 3 months? What needs to get done so that you can say it was a successful period?" "We've got to make more money. We need to grow our market share." "By how much? And what needs to happen for you to get there?" Andrew was frustrated to the point of anger now. "I tell you what, Charlie, I've just about had it with your folksy preaching. It's easy for you to ask all these questions in a vacuum. It's easy to sit outside and drill me here like an attorney because there are no easy answers." "There aren't supposed to be easy answers, Andy. That's why you get paid so much. But you have to come up with answers. Otherwise, there is no accountability. And without accountability, results are a matter of luck. How could you fire Terry and not know what he should have been doing?" Andrew just sat there, shaking his head. Charlie moved forward in his seat. "I think you're afraid to be criticized, Andrew. Afraid to look bad." "No one likes to look bad, Charlie." "Of course they don't. But the price for you is too high. You're driving your company into the ground whether the board of directors realizes it or not." For Andrew, this came out of nowhere. "I'm not afraid to be criticized, and I'm not driving the company into the ground." "Then where is your vision, Andy? Where are your goals? Make a call on something. What are you waiting for?" Suddenly, the train ground to a halt, and the lights flickered and went out again. The two angry men just sat there in the dark for 5 minutes. A full 5 minutes. Then the train began moving again, and Andrew spoke. "So what is my problem here, Charlie?" "Let me tell you something. From what I can tell, many CEOs have the same problems. They finally get the job they've always wanted, and they become afraid to lose their status. Or they don't want to hold people accountable because they're afraid to be unpopular. And even if they aren't afraid to be unpopular, they don't hold people accountable because they haven't bothered to be clear about what they expect from people, because," Andrew finished the rest of the lesson, "because they're afraid to be wrong." "Exactly. My father used to say that there were 3 words which were the most powerful thing a CEO could say. I was wrong. But the thing is, he didn't say those words apologetically. He said them like he was proud of them. He knew that if he couldn't be comfortable being wrong, he wouldn't make tough decisions with limited information. So he must have made a lot of bad decisions. Sure he did, and he owned those decisions. But he never felt guilty about them because he knew that you can't move forward in the face of uncertainty if you aren't willing to make mistakes. And gradually, he made fewer and fewer mistakes. In fact, people said he developed an amazing ability to make good decisions without enough information. They thought he was really smart. He seems pretty smart to me. Charlie smiled. As much as I hate to say it, my father wasn't really any more intelligent than the average person. In fact, he used to say that the key to his success was hiring people who were smarter than him. So how did he learn to make such great decisions? Well, he avoided temptation number 4. It's the temptation to... Charlie was suddenly interrupted by the sound of one of the connecting doors opening. Andrew spun around in his seat to see who it was. Standing in the door was a tall man wearing a suit and hat. "Excuse me. Are you coming back, Charlie? It's been quite a while." Charlie slapped himself on the forehead. "Oh my, I have been gone quite a while, haven't I? I'm so sorry. It's just that I started having such an interesting conversation with Andy here that I lost track of the time. Andy, why don't you come join us? No sense in me running back and forth keeping everyone waiting." Before Andrew could respond, the tall man turned back toward the door to leave. Charlie and Andrew followed him. Andrew was just about to stop and ask Charlie what was going on, but something told him he wasn't supposed to ask. Somehow the situation was just too preposterous for a simple question like, "Where are we going?" or "Who is this guy?" Andrew decided that he would find out in due time. Charlie let Andrew walk ahead of him, which offered him a chance to check out the tall man from 10 feet behind, as they made their way down the swaying length of 7 train cars. The tall man's suit was in good condition, but seemed out of style to Andrew, and his shoes, although new, reminded him of something he had once dragged out of his grandfather's closet. The tall man entered the 7th car and stopped. Andrew heard voices inside, so he hesitated. Charlie patted his shoulder. "Go ahead. They won't bite." "They?" That's all Andrew could get out of his mouth as Charlie nudged him into the next car. Immediately, he noticed that there were 2 other men in the car, in addition to the tall man. Both were in their late 40s or early 50s. They were sitting in the middle section of the train, facing one another, involved in an animated conversation. One was bald. The other wore a stylish double-breasted suit with pinstripes. The tall man spoke. "Excuse me, gentlemen, this is Andy." Charlie chimed in. "Andy is the CEO of Trinity Systems, the technology company. He and I lost track of time." Neither of the men seemed at all surprised to see Andrew, and like Charlie, they didn't react to Andrew's title. The stylish man spoke first. "How far did you fellows get, Charlie?" Charlie looked at Andrew, frowning in thought. "We were just starting temptation number 4, weren't we, Andy?" The 3 men acknowledged temptation number 4 with nods and ahs and smiles. They seemed to know what it meant. The tall man spoke. "Number 4 is my big challenge." Andrew began to feel like he was in the midst of an episode of The Twilight Zone. And then suddenly his concern about the strange situation faded a little as he again became curious about the next temptation. "What is temptation number 4? He directed the question at the tall man, who looked toward Charlie as if to ask permission. Charlie smiled and nodded, so the tall man spoke. "Have a seat and I'll explain it to you." Charlie, Andrew, and the tall man sat down near the others. Taking off his hat, the tall man spoke. "Temptation 4 is the desire for harmony." Without knowing why, Andrew suddenly felt comfortable with these men. He said, "I don't understand. What does harmony have to do with clarity and good decisions?" The bald man spoke for the first time. "From the perspective of a person who doesn't have a problem with temptation number 4, let me explain. Answer a question for me, Andy. What is the opposite of harmony? Andrew thought for a moment. I don't know. Discord? Yes, discord. Disagreement. Conflict. Any of those will do. The point is, it's natural for human beings to want harmony. But harmony is like cancer to good decision-making. You see, the only way to come to a good decision quickly is to pull all of the honest opinions out of people efficiently. There are two ways to do that. One, you can put nice processes in place to massage opinions out of people, focus groups, brainstorming sessions, democratic voting. Or two, you can do it in a messy way. The tall man jumped in. Messy means using conflict, but not bad conflict. We're talking about productive, ideological conflict. From the outside, they look the same, but they're very different. Andrew was starting to grasp their point, but something troubled him. But isn't that the same as Temptation 2, the one where you want to be popular with people instead? The stylish man interrupted. Instead of holding them accountable. We know about Temptation number 2. Right, I guess you do. Anyway, isn't wanting to be popular pretty much the same thing as wanting harmony? The bald man seemed to understand Andrew now. I see where you're confused. Temptation 2 is about not wanting to be rejected as a person. It's about judging yourself by what other people think of you. The stylish man spoke next. You're confusing the fear of being unpopular with the fear of your group being in conflict with one another. Charlie seemed to sense Andrew's skepticism. We're not splitting hairs here, Andy. There is a big difference. The tall man explained. For instance, I don't have a problem holding people accountable for things as long as we all agree what those things are. But sometimes I have a hard time deciding what to hold them accountable for because we make decisions that don't feel right. Andrew turned to Charlie. You said your father almost always made good decisions. That's right, because he almost never made a decision without having the full benefit of everyone's ideas. Right. And that's where I fall down. I don't like it when people challenge one another. I try to steer them away from passionate, heated conversations because I'm afraid that someone is going to come out of it getting hurt or looking bad. I don't have that problem. The bald man's comment brought out laughter in his colleagues. I suppose it has something to do with the way I was raised. My brothers and I argued about things all the time, and 10 minutes later everything was fine. There was never any permanent damage. Me too. I've never had a problem with allowing people to get into it during meetings. In fact, if no one gets a little pushed out of shape during a meeting, I feel like we probably didn't put all our issues on the table. Andrew persisted. I still think that if you have a problem with Temptation 2, you'll struggle with Temptation 4. The stylish man responded. That's sometimes the case. But take me, for example. I love conflict. I can jump up and down on a table, and my people don't hesitate to get in my face about things whenever they feel the need. So we get real clear about what we need to do and about what we're accountable for. It's right out there in front of us. The tall man and the bald man began to laugh. Andrew asked, What's so funny? They're laughing at one of my weaknesses. You see, I sometimes give in to temptation number 2. I let people off the hook. When one of my people comes to me and tells me that they couldn't meet a deliverable or finish a project on time, I always ask them why. And I'll be damned if most of the time they don't have a pretty good reason. So I let them off every once in a while. The bald and tall men objected in unison. Every once in a while? All right, all right. I guess for all my ranting and raving, I'm pretty soft about things. Too much empathy or something. In fact, I do the same thing with my kids. I'll holler at them and we'll have some pretty passionate discussions, if you know what I mean. But then I can't bring myself to actually punish them. Andrew was beginning to like the stylish man. That doesn't sound like such a bad thing to me. It's a horrible thing, horrible. I lose credibility with people. I seem inconsistent and unfair to them. The next time I need someone to actually deliver on something, they're not sure how serious I am about it. And the funny thing is, do you know why I have this problem? Because I want them to like me. I guess it works. They like me, but they don't respect me as much as they would if I were consistent. And without respect..." He didn't have to finish the sentence. Andrew was already nodding. The tall man completed the lesson. "But my problem isn't that I need to be popular. It's just that I don't feel completely right about holding people accountable, because even though I made a clear decision about what they're accountable for, I know in my heart that they haven't really bought into it. And you know why? Because I don't let them air their opinions enough. I stifle their arguments before they have a chance to get clear on things. I just don't like conflict." Andrew added, "And so your decisions aren't based on all the information that your people have to offer." They all nodded. Andrew was beginning to grasp it all, but he still seemed a little confused, overwhelmed. Charlie decided to challenge his pupil. "Why don't you give it a shot, Andy? The Temptations. See if you can remember the first 4. Andrew looked around at the 4 strangers. Before he accepted Charlie's challenge, he asked the unthinkable question. "Who are you guys?" The bald man answered. "We're like you. We're people who've faced these same temptations, but we're not here to talk about us." Charlie agreed. "That's right, Andy. See if you can remember the Temptations." Andrew looked into his reflection in the window as if he were trying to decide whether he could do it.